We'd like to welcome everybody back for this afternoon and go ahead and get started. We know it's short, but we have an interesting session this afternoon. My name is Don Scott from PCS Structural Solutions, part of the Planning Committee. We have our second session today will be on the gap between current and desired performance, of the community's built environment. And we have three wonderful speakers. Ed Fratto from the Northeast States Emergency Consortium, and Justin Cates from Nashua, New Hampshire, right? Their emergency manager will be our first speakers. They are kind of sharing their presentation together, and then we'll have Jay Wilson from Clackamas County follow them. And just a quick introduction. Ed is the Executive Director of the Northeast States Emergency Consortium, located in Wakefield, Massachusetts, Boston. He really is a Red Sox fan today and there we go, and Patriots. Prior to joining the Northeast States Emergency Consortium, he served 13 years as the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. And Justin, like I said, from Nashua, New Hampshire, joined the mayor's cabinet in 2011 after coming from his role as a Homeland Security consultant for the Delaware Emergency Management Agency. So the first two speakers will talk about HAZUS and how they've used that in their planning process. And so I'm going to turn the time over, I guess, Ed, you first.
Okay, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here to talk about how we've supported the city of Nashua using HAZUS. And so today's presentation is going to focus on one part of HAZUS, which is critical and essential facilities, not the full suite of estimates of damage that HAZUS produces. So today we're going to look at the applicability of HAZUS, earthquake, flood, and hurricane performance outputs for critical and essential facilities, and how those might be used in resiliency planning. So first of all, what is HAZUS? So HAZUS is a GIS-based tool developed by FEMA that estimates damage and losses from selected natural hazards. So those hazards are flood, hurricane, that includes wind and surge, earthquake, and also it now includes tsunami for certain portions of the country. So one of the points about HAZUS is the outputs, the performance outputs, really vary by hazard. Earthquake is the most extensive, then flood, hurricane, and tsunami is more limited. So in HAZUS, there's three levels of analysis. So if you just download HAZUS, put your community in, and run it, you'll be running the default hazard inventory. That's going to give you some basic numbers about your losses, your economic losses. But when it comes to critical and essential facilities, they're probably going to be about 75% accurate. You're going to have some schools that have closed, some fire stations that may not be there anymore. So in terms of credibility, if you use HAZUS, you really need to update at least that basic data. Level 2 is where you update that data. And level 3 is when you input specific hazard data. So for Nashua, we've been working at about a 2.5. We've updated over 500 facilities over probably 3 or 4 months, or maybe longer. And we've updated the soils data that's necessary for earthquakes. So the reverse triangle is, the required user, the more effort you put in, the better results you're going to get. So for critical and essential facilities, and these are the types that HAZUS covers, you're going to get some basic performance data that I think might be helpful in your resiliency planning. You can also add user-defined facilities, which are any facilities that you want to put into that critical and essential facilities category. And in Nashua, we added quite a bit of facilities to the basic list. So we ran a total of 19 hazard scenarios for Nashua. We ran all the probabilistic analysis. We also ran some scenario events. Today I'm going to focus pretty much on the scenario events. So for earthquake, yes, we do get earthquakes in New England. We've had some large earthquakes. We have about 40 to 50 small earthquakes, of which about 4 or 5 are felt per year. So what we used for Nashua was an earthquake that occurred in 1638. It's estimated to be about a magnitude 6.5, just north of, it's in central New Hampshire, north of Nashua. The reason we like to bring in the soils is because the ground shaking increases with different types of soils, the softer soils. It increases, and so that does change the results, and especially if you're looking at critical and essential facilities, HAZUS will look at the soil at the specific site. So if you don't bring in soils, it's going to use what's called the default D soil, which may in some cases overestimate the hazard, in other cases could underestimate the hazard. So the facility performance outputs that you get for earthquake, you get probability of functionality days 1 through 90, and you get probability of damage that goes from none to extensive, and then groups those together as at least slight, moderate, and at least extensive. So this is what it looks like. This is just one group of essential facilities. It's not even the complete group, but it gives you some idea of what type of performance output you get. So, can you read that? Yeah, okay. So if you look at Nashua High School North, on day 1, that's the probability of functionality of that facility being able to function is at about 79%. And then you can carry that out over a 90-day period. The way this can be useful is if the community feels that, look, we want to make sure that following an earthquake event, that our schools would be back in functioning in 7 days or 14 days. You can kind of look at these estimates of functionality, and you'll get some sense of whether you'll be able to achieve that goal. And also what other planning might be done if the buildings do have a problem for you to compensate for that. It also gives us this probability of damage. So the first item here is the Goddard School. So that has a 76.3% probability that there'll be no damage at that facility. And you can see there's the probability for damage for the schools that are listed here in the range from the 60s to 80s. And then if you get into more, extensive damage, you can see those probabilities are going down. So it gives you some sense in terms of performance of your schools. With hospitals, it does a little bit more extensive analysis. It looks at the total number of beds. It groups those by large hospital and small hospital. So in this case, about 74% of the beds are expected to be functional. And this is useful because HAZUS also gives you an estimate of casualties, ranging from fatalities down to, injuries that don't require hospitalization. It also provides that same information for the transportation infrastructure, the utility infrastructure, and again, if you put in user-defined facilities as critical and essential, it will provide you that same data. For hurricane, for Nashua, we used the 1938 hurricane, which is sort of the signature hurricane for the Northeast. So HAZUS gives us peak gusts, and these are the peak gusts for the 1938 hurricane. And when we run the probabilistic analysis for hurricane, you can see how the peak gusts increase as you go into the 1,000-year event. So what you can use this for is if you know what your building code requirement is, you can kind of match it up with a probabilistic event if you want to use that as sort of the baseline analysis for your community. So hurricane gives us loss of use days and probability of damage from minor to destructive. So this is what it looks like. Again, this is Nashua High School North. The first column there is loss of use days, and you can see they're all zeros The wind speeds in Nashua are relatively below the, significant damage level. And you can see that there's a 0.03% probability of minor damage and a 0 probability of moderate or higher. So it gives you some sense that based on this scenario event, that the schools would be pretty much functioning in Nashua. For flood, again, we ran the full suite of probabilistic events, but we focused on the 500-year flood, which is the FEMA requirement for critical and essential facilities. So flood provides us with building and contents damage, an estimate of the damage in percent. It gives us some sense of whether the facility will be functional and non-functional. And it also gives us days to 100% functionality. And we find that the results on that can vary based on different parts of the country. For us in the Northeast, we think it tends to underestimate the damage because we have a lot of older facilities. So this is what the results look like. And when we ran the 500-year flood for Nashua, we only had a few facilities that actually fell within that flood boundary. So this is a medical clinic. The building damage percent is 2.94, and the damage percent, the contents damage percent, which is the second column, is the same. So it's a relatively low percentage of damage. So in terms of utilities, this is the wastewater facilities that were located in HAZUS, and you can see that on line 2 there that the damage percent is 40%, and that facility is considered to be non-functional, where the first facility is 0%, and that facility is expected to be functional. So in flood, it just tells you what the damage percent would be and whether HAZUS is estimating that that facility would be functional or non-functional. How can you get HAZUS? You can download the latest version. It's free. It does run on ArcGIS, so you have to have that, or you would have to purchase that. There's the link to where you can download it, or you can just Google HAZUS download, and it'll bring you to the download page. And I think that ends it for me, and now I'll turn it over to Justin.
So my portion of the presentation is really just to kind of bookend both pieces of what Ed had just talked about, because essentially our responsibility in this was to determine what the desired performance of our buildings and infrastructure was in the city. We pass that off to Ed. He then does the modeling, and then we convert that information using the various products that HAZUS provides and turn that into the anticipated performance of those buildings and infrastructure, all following the NIST community resilience process. So the first piece of that, the development of the desired performance, we put together a very collaborative planning team in the city, ranging from people who were just interested citizens to the city engineer, the soup kitchen to the country club. We actually had a really good turnout through this entire process in comparison to what you might find during a typical hazard mitigation planning process. In most cases, people don't want to participate in those. I wonder why. But we ended up trying to convince people that this was important for the city, and we added a lot of other stuff into it to make it interesting. And we used the NIST process to go through anticipated performance, the modeling, and then to or desired performance, then the modeling, then to anticipated performance. So critical and essential to Nashua. That was one of the first things that we had to identify in order to prepare the facilities list for Ed to go through and model. So the collaborative planning team first, with the help of the NIST Community Resilience Fellows and the ARA folks and Steve Kaufman, we went through the process of figuring out what is important based on the social capital connections and their tie to infrastructure and buildings. And we came up with a huge list of nearly 500 facilities that were important to the city to recover after a disaster. And this is just a good example. We have our Nashua Police Department, which is very essential to the city. And then you have something like our substation, which is a location for police officers to go in and do their paperwork. So it's all going to be based on that collaborative planning team. What do they think is important for the city? Then, in order to get all the data that was necessary for HAZUS, we worked through a process that Ed has very creatively come up with to use assessing data, street view imagery, pictometry, that's the bird's eye imagery basically, as well as subject matter expert interviews to get information on the construction type of all of these different facilities across the city. And we could not have done this without Ed and Northeast States Emergency Consortium. That's a resource that is tremendous to us in New England, and it's something that I think as we progress forward with this process, we have to figure out a way to continue to leverage resources like Ed and his team. So after we collected all the information about the buildings and the structures and all the other stuff that was necessary, we had to figure out what types of scenarios to run in HAZUS. And so we used the NIST guide to start down the path of determining those scenarios. NIST guide table 4.4 uses ASCE 710 design loads as the way to determine the routine, design, and extreme events for that community. And because HAZUS only runs earthquake, flood, and hurricane, we focused on those specifically for this process. So questions came up. Do we want to use the existing building code in the city of Nashua, which is the 2009, or do we want to look at the most up-to-date and best available data for the most current building code? Do we want to look at the extreme scenarios that Ed had mentioned? Those are things that have realistically happened, and if you read the NIST guide, it says, what are those extreme events that could consider, that the collaborative planning team can consider to actually happen in the city? And then, we have to be realistic in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is the live free or die state, and that's the reason why we're still in the 2009 building code, is because everybody wants to do their own thing. And so in order for me to go back to our collaborative planning team, I need to be realistic with them and say, look, I understand that there's an interest in going to this level, but how can we meet in the middle so that we can get the political support and also ensure that our community can be more resilient? The biggest thing I found when working with our collaborative planning team, that those folks from the soup kitchen to the city engineer, and even myself, was understanding risk. It's very challenging for the layperson to really understand how risk works. And when we're trying to compare it to the NIST process and import information into HAZUS, we need to understand those mean recurrence intervals and look at what data sources we can use to figure out what is likely or is likely to be experienced in the city of Nashua. So there's definitely a lot of work to do on the risk side of it. And the other piece of it is not just about ensuring that our buildings are more structurally sound moving forward. It's what types of contingency plans can we put into place based on the data that we're getting from HAZUS. We might decide, okay, well, if 30% of the schools aren't available, can we put more people into the schools that are up and running? That's part of the resilience planning process. But all those decisions go back to the community stakeholders, and that's the big difference between the way that we used to do it and the way that we're doing it now. It's not my decision, it's the community's decision on how they're going to move forward and improve this. And we'll skip on the questions, and we'll move on to the next one.
And next, we're going to hear from Jay Wilson from Clackamas County, Oregon, out in my neck of the woods, as we would say. I'm from Seattle. And Jay is the Clackamas County Resilience Coordinator with the Department of Department of Disaster Management, and spearheads the county efforts to reduce risk and assess hazards. So, Jay?
Thank you. Let's set my water down right here. Good afternoon, post-lunch sleepers. I've got a lot of slides to go through, and I know we're behind schedule, so hold on. I'm here talking about the 5-year interval from the 2013 Oregon Resilience Plan, the nature of how the plan was constructed and the gap analysis that was done then, and where we are 5 years later, especially at implementing the statewide plan down to the local level. I'm the former chair of our State Seismic Commission, and you're fortunate to have two other commission chairs here in the room, Kent Yu and Jay Raskin as well. If you have any questions about our plan in Oregon, you're welcome to talk to any of us. I use this slide. It's sentimental to me, but when we were finishing up the delivery of this plan to our state legislature in 2013, this was the opening slide that we had shown in 5 hearings we had at the state capitol to emphasize why this report on the magnitude 9 earthquake and tsunami for Oregon is a wake-up call that you can't unsee the elephant that's in the room. That we demand that all of us in the communities across Oregon, we have to factor in this particular event into our long-term planning for ourselves and for our future generations. So just quickly, this was the cover of our plan. It had a big alarm clock situated on the top of the state capitol building to emphasize that time is of the essence for us to change our direction from complacency and the status quo, and we need to factor resilience into all of our decision making. We made this a 50-year plan because we can't get out of this in just a few years, and it has to be multi-generational, and it's a marathon, not a sprint. And our focus is saving lives, protecting our economy, and preserving our communities. One of the things we had to do, as has been discussed already, is defining resilience. And in our plan, it was pretty basic. It was on the cover just then. We really want to speed the recovery and rebuild better, as well as save lives, reduce losses. But in looking at the nature of where we are on this graph, we're the low-hanging red line that gets knocked way down because so much of our infrastructure was built prior to knowing this risk. We looked at Chile and Japan, both from the 2010 and 2011 earthquake and tsunami events, and they were both those nations were able to restore 90% of their service delivery within basically a month. And for Chile especially, from the 1960 to 2010, the 50-year interval, they were able to actually restore most of their services here in this Teakley report diagram within days, not weeks. And it was an inspiration for us to say, we think we can do that, but we've got to start doing it now. And so we set about forming a plan of action of how we did this. We had the magnitude 9 scenario that was the basis for our understanding. We had 2 different groups, business and workforce, and then the coastal communities that informed the decision making for these 5 sectors: critical buildings, energy, information, communications, transportation, water, wastewater. Some of this is very familiar because a lot of this came from the Resilient City Plan from San Francisco and also is mentioned and referred to in the NIST guide. We developed these steps, and right up front is assessing the performance of all of these facilities with the best available data at the time. We have to have these goals based on the community needs, the business needs, not just what we think we can do and that's good enough. We have to come up with time frames for service restoration, which is interdependent on one another. And then also, ultimately, the plan was about recommendations for strategic priorities going forward into the future. One of the aspects about this, which is a little different than community-based planning, was this was a statewide plan for an event that's going to affect the whole state. On the far left margin is the offshore delineation of the subduction zone plate boundary. And so we had these 4 zones that we decided based on the impacts from this event that we were going to plan for. Central and Eastern Oregon in green, the I-5 corridor, where most of the economy and the population lives, in yellow. And then the coast has 2 zones. There's a gold zone for everything outside of the tsunami zone. And at the time, looking at Japan, it didn't seem realistic for us to actually set recovery goals for the tsunami zone because of so much uncertainty and dependencies on opportunities and restrictions. So we didn't even touch that. But the coastal zone we looked at outside of the inundation areas. And what we came up with were these resilience gaps of our current state of affairs. The business model that we used was a 2 to 4 week timeline on critical restoration of service, or businesses, or small businesses especially, are going to go out of business, that their employees can't go to work, if these businesses are just basically going into debt rather than resuming, that this was our 50-year target. And looking at what we currently had, the print's a little bit fine, but we were looking in the I-5 corridor of 1 to 3 months of restoration of electricity, probably to most, but not all, to 90%. But on the coast, on most cases, it's about a multiplier of 3 in terms of the isolation and the challenges of the topography out there. But going down to drinking water and sewer, that one, because most of the infrastructure is underground, is looking at 1 month to 1 year's restoration, and that's just on the I-5 corridor. On the coast, that's 1 to 3 years. And so the imperative for us to start taking action now, especially on every new capital improvement project, is right there, staring us in the face. And one example of this plan from 2013 is the water wastewater recovery kind of gap analysis that was done with X's being on the far right that are measured in months and years, and then these timelines for percentages of restoration from 20 to 30% in red, 50 to 60% in yellow, and then up to 90% in green. And there's some similarities this way to the NIST Community Resilience Plan. And so one of the big things to take away from this when we're communicating this report and what it means is, one, focusing on the interdependencies. That's a big piece of what we're all here understanding, is most of our prior reports focus just on damage and replacement, but not how all these things fit together. And then this whole issue around cost versus value. What do you get when you replace a bridge before an earthquake, and the cost versus the cost of the community to replace it, one, afterwards, but also the loss of all the functionality that comes with it, and articulating that to decision makers. And then lastly, we made it very clear that this report was based on, a year's worth of voluntary work, and that everything needs more detailed assessments in order to make very sound, defensible targets and priorities for going forward. And so here, for the rest of this, I'm going to go quickly just to show you current examples in 2018 of what we've done since then and how we're getting to more detailed analysis and assessments with data and meeting those timelines. First off is just looking at the hazard. In February of this year, the Department of Geology in Oregon released a very updated report on the Cascadia event. This is focusing just on the 3-county area in the Portland metro area, but it's the new basis for how we're analyzing all of the ground shaking, ground deformation data and how that affects the built environment. From the last time we did it was probably, I'm guessing, in the late 90s, and a very poor understanding. We have a rich understanding now of the nature of these events compared to that. One of the key data points of applying to this new earthquake and ground shaking data are building inventories. This happens to be a map of unreinforced masonry brick buildings in Portland. We have the highest concentration on the West Coast at this time of about 1,600 buildings. And so coming up with the quantity of these buildings is fairly straightforward, but the quality of that data is really critical in coming up with performance levels. And it's really hard in a lot of these cases to know if these buildings have been retrofit at some point, how well the retrofits were done, to what design standards, how well maintained the buildings are. And so when you're doing modeling on loss estimation, there's a lot of uncertainty around the data depending on the quality of what you're using for these buildings. And mentioning that, this is a key decision point when it comes to setting performance goals. Is it retrofitting or resilience? And what does the community expect and want? Retrofitting old schools means you're bringing a non-compliant building that wasn't earthquake, built to any earthquake standards when it was brand new, up to some level of performance, probably so it won't fail, but it may still be unusable and have to be torn down. There's a state grant program that's been in effect for a little over a decade that's working very hard and diligently, but it's making small dents in getting these buildings to be safe for the sake of not failing. But they don't necessarily translate into resilience at a community scale. On the other hand, the Beaverton, the city of Beaverton School District, there's a report here that I'm referencing on their embracing resilience in the design standards for these two new schools, building them to very high tolerances for performance during an earthquake so they can be immediately reoccupied, with all kinds of other safety features for the functionality of the school to return to service. And that's where you have to wonder, what does the public understand? How do you defend these two decisions based on the expectations that the public has for return to service? Another arena is transportation. Since the 2013 report, our State Department of Transportation has been very much full forward on working on seismic improvements for the 3 different tiers across the state, especially on bridges. And I'm just showing here examples of 3 reports in the last few years emphasizing the investment that they're making in understanding and planning for the criticality of the function of these bridges. Statewide transportation assessment for benefits for retrofit, looking at bridge retrofit measures for a subduction quake, and then what are the impacts and the evaluation criteria on these bridges. All very critical data points for the decision-making and long-term strategic investments. And so here's the real gist of my presentation that's going to be a rapid fire here. I wanted to talk about one project in detail, and this is from the Portland Water Bureau, thanks to Mike Sturr, who's the new administrator, and he was on our original planning team at this, with the state plan. But they've got the state plan goals that they created, and they're implementing these right down to their city water district level. And so what you're seeing here, going right here, here's a reference to their $1.6 million study and budget that they completed last year of setting up an approach for them to reach the performance standards that are in the Oregon Resilience Plan. And so they have a task list that they went through in putting this together about determining the ground deformation, assessing the pipeline and facilities, modeling the backbone of the system, how does it tie into emergency preparedness and response, and then prioritizing the measures. And I just thought it's worthwhile to quickly walk through this. The task 1 was understanding the hazard and the nature of the exposure of their infrastructure to the hazard, like ground deformation. Then they had to go out and do studies on the actual ground behavior, and they had thousands of bore logs that they had to look at, as well as all of the new updated mapping on liquefaction, lateral spreading, landslides. This is critical for them to see what parts of their system are vulnerable. And then assessing all of the different facilities and the fragility curves of those facilities for the sake of their impact and vulnerability. And of course, referencing standing studies across the United States on those types of facilities for the sake of those fragilities as well. And then looking at temporary ground deformation, permanent ground deformation, that's what those acronyms are for, but looking at the pipe breaks and the separations across their backbone system and across the entire system as a basis for where they're going to target. And then looking at their model backbone system, this lower left hand, the ORP goal, the resilience plan goal, is to have the backbone in service within 24 hours of the event. And so that's a real gap that they need to fill in the next 50 years or less to achieve the service delivery that's the basis for getting their system back online in a day. And modeling that with all of the information and data that they have in order to best anticipate the performance and then the critical areas that need work. Task 4 was looking at how their plans tie into other existing plans and how it supports the assumptions of those plans. The repair plan for the Bureau. Where do they harden the system and where do they do emergency workarounds for the sake of getting water and service delivery up and running again based on their gaps and their delivery timelines. But even more critically on this level is the immediate need for fire service to rely on the water system for performance levels. And so referencing what are the assumptions and needs of the fire service. And critically looking at the way the fire service plans for strategically for the amount of use that they need and the level of service delivery based on what's going on at any given time. It's crucial that these plans all are tied together and are working from the same page. And then lastly is developing and prioritizing mitigation measures based on all of this work ahead of it. What's going to be the high, medium, and low trajectories? And so here they have, pictures of big reports, but 36 capital improvement projects for $980 million, another 16, laying out a priority list and a defensible plan of evidence-based work for meeting the targets that they've set. And then they come up with, here's the first 10 years of that capital improvements plan and the recommendations for how they're going to administer it as a program. And then lastly for them, saying, well, that's just the beginning. That's all the technical analysis. There's all these other steps at a community level to get this work implemented, working with city council, utility boards, getting funding and staff, engineering planning, interagency coordination, design, public involvement, land use, and last permitting. All of those things have to be accounted for in striving to get this work off the ground and targeted and laid out for the future. And so lastly, I also wanted to talk about the fact that it's not just the technical data, it's also the public, it's also the qualitative work. The Multnomah County, which is where Portland is located, has been working now for about a year on an earthquake-ready bridge project for their main drawbridge across the Willamette River. And just this last month ago, they've had several open houses where they're inviting the public to come in and make their voices heard and have a community engagement, talking and listening sessions so that it's a dialogue about what resilience looks like in the community. And they have these multiple options for the nature of what they're going to do with this bridge that the public gets to understand and weigh in on, and have a community task force even for the sake of having a formal way of having an engaging dialogue and process between the jurisdiction and the public, which I think is vital. And then lastly, I wanted to just highlight a planning session that the City of Portland had done earlier, and this is the report of the findings from June, resilient infrastructure planning exercise that they conducted. And they had a full day of all the bureaus sitting down together and rolling up their sleeves and talking about the interaction that they would have in a major disaster. And one of the takeaways from the report is a quote that came out of a public opinion survey the city did on emergency preparation from Portlanders. And it looked at it, the quote was 83% of the Portlanders expect government to provide emergency aid within 3 days, which we're now preaching 2 weeks. So this is a kind of a wake-up call for all of us about what the expectations of the public is. Is it realistic? And that 42% they would leave if water and electricity is not restored within 2 weeks. And that's also a big eye-opener for us in terms of that whole 2 to 4 week timeline of restoring 90% of our service target. And so that's a direct reflection back to the statewide timelines that we initially established and what we need to work on. And then lastly, this quote from that same report that I think is important for us in this setting, they identified that we need to have these key projects identified as groups, that we need to align our work plans together so that we're not all competing internally for limited resources. We'll be better if we align what we need to do together. And that we have decision makers who are basically just waiting to make decisions, but we all have to become advocates. Advocates for resilience, advocates through our departments and up the food chain so that the importance of this gets factored into all of our decision making. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one question, maybe two. For Ed, Justin, or Jay, if anybody would have some, if they want to go to the mic.
What I'm interested in, I'm Lisa Craig, I'm from the city of Annapolis, Maryland. We have a state climate plan, it's terrific. We're all moving forward towards it. And I'm very interested in hearing both in New Hampshire and in Oregon. One of the things we found in our plan is it's really a wonderful plan to encourage communities to do the level of planning, both looking at CIP projects and looking at resilience plans, hazard mitigation plans, but there's not a lot of regulatory requirements or incentives being made available. So communities like Annapolis, which have done some model planning efforts, are trying to spread it around the rest of the state. But it's one thing to encourage. It's another thing to create the incentives or requirements to get local communities to do what needs to be done. Can you guys address that issue?
Yeah, so I'll do it very simply. For New Hampshire, again, live free or die. So it just took somebody saying we need to do this, we want to do this, and that was the only thing that got us in that direction. There was a direction from our leadership that they wanted to see it happen, but that doesn't mean that once our mayor leaves, that same level of interest will continue. So it's got to take a champion in the community to make it happen, unfortunately.
I'll champion the champion idea because you don't necessarily get to pick where the advocates step up from. They're not necessarily going to be department directors. And so when you have someone who's outspoken and passionate, we need to find ways to nurture that and integrate them into the process. For us, in having a design event that we've never experienced before, we're really challenged by a lot of complacency. And so we're having to try and translate lessons from somewhere else, like from Japan. And, 5 years ago, it was really a big deal. People got it, and I think we got a lot of awareness generated, and we've had some momentum and changes in structure and administration. I think we have a state resilience officer now who's helping to focus this in the hallways of the state capitol. In fact, one of the best examples of the progress is our current governor, who's running for office and re-election, just last week released a 2025 resilience plan calling for an update after 10 years in 2023 and a number of investments based on this resilience plan and reinvesting in that going forward. And so I've said we're still very early into this process. I think we are walking we're talking our talk pretty good. We're starting to just take steps in walking our talk. And the challenge is really going to be to keep up the momentum and build on that.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, we'll take our break now and go into our next sessions. You're in your same rooms as you were before, so please go back there. It is now 2:18 or something, so let's plan on 2:30 being in our room.